The bases of organizations that Iran considers to be Israel and the United States' stooges are burning tonight. The skies of Erbil were filled with explosions. An unverified video shows how fireball emerged in the sky. Smoke spread out throughout the city of Erbil, which is the capital of Iraq's Kurdistani autonomy. There's a drone's buzz right before impact. Anti-aircraft guns firing and missed. Who's responsible for this specific strike? A strike that hit organizations that are tied to American and Israeli intelligence. All we know is this: there's explosions in one of the closest allies of the United States, and it is targeting enemies of Iran. Nobody believes that that is a coincidence. Now, this wasn't just one blast, it was a wave of attacks. And that's how attacks are usually conducted nowadays. Waves of drones designed to overpower defenses. And since a bunch of them hit, we saw repeated explosions across Erbil and the districts around it. It was Al Jazeera that reported that at least 4 drones were seen over Khalifan and Soran, and large fires were sparked by hits. 2 also crashed before reaching their targets. Opposition groups admitted to receiving damage. Komala's headquarters were hit as well. Coalition defenses shot down several more of the drones, but as we saw, several of them appears to hit. But as we said, it's really not clear who's behind these attacks. Not everyone agrees Iran did this directly. A lot of Iraqis suspect that something else is at play. The Iraqi militias are, of course, heavily involved in local politics, and not everything that they do has to do with what their Iranian masters want them to do. The Iraqi prime minister is perceived by them as an enemy, perceived by them as being too pro-American, too pro-Kurdish, and not attuned enough to Shiite rights. Therefore, one Iraqi analyst believes that they made this attack in order to embarrass the Iraqi prime minister, who had just come back from a visit to Washington, D.C., in an attempt to not only cause him political damage, but also damage relations with the United States. That would also explain why some of these attacks appeared to have been targeted at American bases. But of course, it could also be Iran. Nobody's closed the case. We don't know yet what happened. Could also be there was Iraqi militias under the orders of Iran. So why were these buildings hit? Why are they important? For Tehran, these Kurdish organizations aren't a foreign policy issue. It's not something about the balance of power in another country. It's a domestic issue. So let's take a step back for a minute. What are the Kurds? You probably know this, but the Kurds are people, an ethnic group that exists in several countries. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. So they have an international presence. Now, the community of Kurds in Iran is relatively small, but they've been politicized heavily recently. Israel and the United States really hope to use these organizations as part of an effort to destabilize the Iranian regime and ultimately change it in their geopolitical favor. So what are the organizations that are worth knowing here? There's the KDPI, sometimes called the KI, the oldest and largest group of all. There's Komala, with roots in the Kurdish left. There's PAK, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, younger and more hawkish. And there's PJAK, PJAK, which fields fighters inside Iran's own border areas. And that's typical for the Kurds. They have a lot of organizations that compete with each other and occasionally fight each other. One of the reasons the Kurds don't have independence today. They can organize in this region because Iraqi Kurdistan isn't some ordinary province. It's a semi-autonomous region. It is part of the Iraqi country, but the Iraqi government has very limited control there. So it has its own government, its own courts, its own army, known as the Peshmerga, where women also serve. Baghdad technically holds foreign policy and defense, even that is in question. They have a profit sharing agreement on oil and so on and so forth. And all this is designed to stop them from declaring independence. When they did declare independence, they were stopped from doing so by Turkey very quickly. Because again, this is seen as an internal matter by a lot of countries. For Turkey, what the Kurds do in Iraq is an internal matter. For Iran, what the Kurds do in Iraq is an internal matter. It influences their internal cohesion. So in practice, the Kurdish regional government runs its own relationship for decades. And that includes close relationship with the United States through a U.S. consulate in Erbil. And that's the autonomy that exactly allows the Iranian opposition groups to exist there. And that's why Iran keeps hitting. These Kurds who have ambitions in Iran are allowed to run free in this autonomy. There's sympathy for them as well. And that has turned Iran into an enemy. Now, interestingly enough, if you know the history, the Iranians used to sponsor Kurdish independence back when there was the Iraq-Iran war. They were very close allies. Now they're increasingly seen as enemies. Only how geopolitics in the Middle East can flip very quickly. So Iran accuses the Kurdish government of backing separatists inside its own borders and has spent years hitting them with missiles, drones, and artillery. They're just one country that has struck there. Turkey has struck there as well. So the Kurdish autonomy is very often targeted from the outside by the countries that don't want the Kurds to have independence. Now, here's a number to chew on. There's nearly 700 missile and drone attacks on the Kurdistan region since this war began. That's 700, but that's a very small region that doesn't have a lot of hardened targets to withstand them. This isn't an abstract issue. Kurdistan Freedom Party member was assassinated in Erbil on July 2nd. Tehran is now filing Interpol red notices to arrest opposition leaders in Iraq and in Europe. For Iran, this is turning into an important front in what it sees as an existential struggle against Israel and the United States. So we've already talked about the Americans, the Kurds, Iranians, Israelis. What about Iraq? Iraq is supposedly a sovereign country. This is all happening on its ground. There's no question that Baghdad did not order these strikes. Baghdad is now fairly closely allied with the United States. They say they don't want it, and there's reason to believe that they truly don't. They condemned the attacks. They summoned the Americans and the Iranians to the embassy. They moved towards a complaint at the UN, but there is a twist. Not long ago, back in 2023, under Iranian pressure, Iraq agreed to disarm these same Kurdish groups and move them from the border. It went so far, this agreement, that weapons were actually handed over. So when Baghdad calls this a violation of its sovereignty, it's actually defending groups it once agreed to help dismantle, groups that it considers, at least officially, to be illegitimate. But those groups were never truly dismantled. A lot of that was optics, because Baghdad is not a strong government. They need to please the Americans. They need to avoid shootouts with the Kurds, and they need to please the Iranians. So they find these political solutions, and that was one of them. This was not a deal they ever truly intended to honor, but they're actually very clearly, by defending these groups, going against the agreement that they went and signed in 2023. Now, Iraq's new prime minister, Ali al-Zaidi, inherited that contradiction and is being put under pressure by all of these factors. And of course, like previous Iraqi prime ministers, he doesn't have an answer to all these problems. So you have two foreign powers pulling on the same thread, and Baghdad is stuck in the middle. It doesn't have answers to any of this. Now, going back to the beginning of this war in Iran, DC pressed Kurdish leaders to open a front against Tehran. Israel was also involved in arming them. Al-Mayadeen claims the U.S. even warned that refusing would put the region's political future at risk. They were threatening the Kurds with consequences for their autonomy, for their future independence, for arming them if they didn't get involved. This hasn't been confirmed, but it certainly is the American MO especially with Trump, who's very transactional and doesn't shy away from threatening actors, to put it mildly. Tehran's counter message is even more blunt. If you join this war, expect a fierce military response from us. And even without joining the war, it looks like there may have been an Iranian military response anyway, although probably not as fierce as it would have been. So the Kurds are caught, squeezed between American pressure and Iranian threats over a war that really isn't their war, and they don't want much to do with it. They opted out of it. But back in March, when the war first broke out, the picture was very different. CNN and Axios reported that the CIA was discussing arming the very same Kurdish groups to open a second front against Iran. PJAK even admitted it moved fighters to the border on standby. A Komala official even said they would cross into Iran within a few days. DC never confirmed any of this. This was just in the media. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said, quote, "None of our objectives are premised on the support or the arming of any particular force," end quote. Which is probably true in terms of this wasn't an essential part of their plan, but it was part of their plan. The White House confirmed Trump had spoken with Kurdish leaders, but they denied agreeing to any specific plan. So did it happen? There is recent reporting that says no, that this actually was erroneous. The group chose to stay out. PJAK put it like this, quote, "Even when the Iranian regime was at its weakest, we adhered to our independent course," end quote. What we know is that the arms front Washington floated in March never opened. What we don't know exactly is why. It could have been because the Kurds judged that their efforts would be unsuccessful, that they managed to see ahead that this war in Iran is not going to go the way that the US thought that it would go. Then came footage that raised the stakes for DC significantly. A drone reportedly targeting a site hosting US forces, not Kurdish ones, in Erbil. Tasnim circulated the video. It's also unverified. But what is confirmed is that the base that it targeted has been hit before, repeatedly. Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain are among the many American bases that have come under fire in this war. Erbil is just another one on that list, and not one that gets noticed. It's not a base that US talks about very publicly, and it's not a particularly big one. And this war already cost American lives right here. On July 18th, a US service member was killed in a controlled detonation of an unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. It was the 17th American service member killed since the war began in February. It happened right in Erbil. Now, the way Tehran tells it, it says Washington violated the Islamabad Memorandum. That's the deal, the MOU, signed on June 17th by backing a shipping arrangement that Iran says broke the agreement's terms. So from the Iranian perspective, whatever attacks are occurring in Iraq are in response to the American breaking of the MOU. So to them, this isn't aggression, this is enforcement. Either way, the deal is dead. On July 8th, Trump himself said it was over. And we really don't know where this war is going. Right now, the US is escalating, but talks are continuing. Trump says there's two paths forward. Deal or, quote, take them part piece by piece. So read that carefully. The President of the United States is describing Iran's military as something Washington could just keep dismantling while talks supposedly continue. But it doesn't appear that they can dismantle the Iranian army. There is very little evidence in general that you can win a war from the air. And Tehran answered with the kind of bravado we're used to them, and it came fast. They say mediation isn't the problem. They say America's bullying and coercion is. They say, quote, "We fear no one, and we will not retreat in the face of any threat," end quote. The Iranians feel like they have escalation dominance, that the further the violence escalates in this war, the more leverage they have over the United States. They believe that the United States cannot take the pain that they can take. The standoff has a clock on it. Analysts warn the ceasefire could collapse into full-scale fighting again if a deal isn't locked in by mid-August. And the place where that clock is loudest isn't in DC, and it isn't in Tehran, it's in Erbil, and it's in Baghdad. Government now protesting to the UN over strikes on groups it once agreed to disarm. Explosions are confirmed, attacks on opposition camps confirmed, the interceptions, Baghdad's protests, 17 American service members dead since February. We don't know who's behind the strikes, the footage, the invasion threats, whether Washington's Kurdish front ever really existed. But step back and the pattern is very clear. Kurdish opposition groups that Tehran wants gone are in the crossfire. American bases that Iran keeps hitting. A government in Baghdad that is caught in between these forces. Kurdish leadership that chose neutrality but got war anyway. Nearly 700 attacks on them despite that choice. Wars are unpredictable. They don't tell you where they will expand next, but there are signs. And there's a lot of signs that Iraq is where it's going to expand to. Every sign points to it. This corner of northern Iraq, but also the rest of the country, where the fires are already burning and they could get higher. Neither side has blinked. Subscribe to WLA for daily geopolitical analysis.